Here we go. This is Nehemiah part 3. Nehemiah part 3. Previously, Nehemiah's broken heart had changed what he wanted to be more like what God wanted. Nehemiah's prayers have taken him to new and unfamiliar places where he would become part of God's answer to his prayers. Sometimes we want to pray prayers where we hope someone else would become the answer to his prayers. They could change or something and we could carry on regardless. Not Nehemiah. This week we find out what happens when Nehemiah begins acting as God wanted him towards rebuilding, restoring, and renewing. So, I'm going to read from the Bible. It may come up on the screen there. If the guys have got the words, that would be great. Nehemiah chapter 2, and I'm going to start at verse 9. Nehemiah's talking about his journey. He says, "Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officials of the army and horsemen. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one which I rode. I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate." I think we know what that one was used for. "And I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool. But there was no room for me, no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall. And I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials did not know where I'd gone or what I was doing, and I'd not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work. Then I said to them, 'You see the trouble we're in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned? Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision.' And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, 'Let us rise up and build.' So they strengthened their hands for the good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, 'What's this thing that you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king?' And I replied to them, 'The God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will arise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem.'" Wow. When I personally began repairing or making something, it wasn't quite grand building on that scale. DIY is about as far as I ever get to. Stuff happens that I'm not expecting. I don't know if that's your experience, if you take on those tasks at home. For starters, I never quite expect how much time I'll spend looking for my own tools. I collect them together and I put them down somewhere and they're with me for the job and then they're not there. And it always takes longer. These days, I know how that works. But these days too, I spend more time looking at my phone because some helpful person for sure has put a YouTube video of them smugly achieving this seemingly impossible DIY task where it all works absolutely fine, and there you go, in 5 minutes it's fixed on their video. But before that, I used to look at this fine volume. My handy, complete DIY manual. There was no job around home that this item couldn't help me with all its wisdom. There are some fine interiors pictured in here and wiring diagrams that might not even be legal anymore. But in it too, there's an assortment of bookmarks. There's envelopes with my own attempts at wiring diagrams and a few calculations, how many pots of paint I was going to need, and so on. But the most important bookmark is actually this one here. It's a kind of file divider. It tells me what's going on with the circuit board before it was all marked up like it is these days. But even more important than that, written on the top at the back, in my wife's fair hand, it says, "Remember, no matter what, I love you." And if I'm honest, that probably tells you something about my complex relationship with DIY. But more than that, it tells you a lot about how kind and encouraging my wife is. Those times when I encountered things I didn't expect, and there was no YouTube, and I wasn't quite sure what the manual said, it's good to look at the bookmark and think about what'll happen, whatever I manage to do. But today we're going to look at Nehemiah. We're going to look at what we might expect as we begin God's work. We're going to think about what happens when we begin his work of rebuilding, restoring, and renewing. Because there are some things that Nehemiah encountered as he travels towards Jerusalem. In fact, the first thing happens before he's even got there. In verse 9, we find that when we are rebuilding, restoring, and renewing, do you know what? It may be unpopular. Nehemiah hadn't even arrived in Jerusalem, and the governing officials of the neighboring areas, those en route where he would have needed to stay for hospitality as he traveled there, stay at their kindness. We're not told why, but we know that they're pretty unimpressed about this. They're not very pleased at all at what he's attempting, what he's thinking about doing. We know from earlier on in the Bible that previous attempts at wall building in Jerusalem had been not only opposed, but forcibly stopped. What's abundantly clear in this is that absolutely no one is saying, "Well done you, Nehemiah. Jerusalem was absolutely ripe for regeneration. You know, real estate values in the vicinity have just fallen through the floor. I'm so glad you're doing something about the place. It's looked shabby for decades." No, quite the opposite of that. It seems reasonable, knowing where Sanballat would have been, that he would have been one of those governors who would have seen the king's letters as he received the king's entourage with this bloke who doesn't even come from round here. He was born in captivity. What does he think he's going to do? What's he about in this place? They would have traveled across Sanballat's patch, and he's like, "Pah, letters from the king, that's the last thing we need here." Coming and mucking stuff up, changing it around. We're not told why, and so I don't think it's worth speculating why he didn't particularly want that. But the point is that attempting things for other people's benefit and good doesn't necessarily make us popular, and it doesn't necessarily make them happy. We see that straight away in this chapter of Nehemiah 2. That happens in other areas of life. Sometimes I feel like parenting's a bit like that. It can happen in political arenas too, when people hope they're doing things for other people's good. In so many ways, someone might be trying to put traffic calming into a village with a speeding problem, and before they know it, the whole village hates them. This is the world at which it can be when we're trying to do some good for others. Being a Jesus follower isn't, though, only meant to be good for you. It's meant to be good for everyone. Everyone you know, everyone you don't know. It's meant to be good for people, whether or not you like them, whether or not they like you. It's meant to be good for the planet. I want to make that kind of a difference. The thing is, it won't always be popular. We'll be surprised. We may even struggle in our life and in our faith if we're expecting to be popular as Jesus followers. Of course, we're not trying to be unpopular. Well, that would be being rebellious or just being controversial. We don't want to do that. It's just that it can happen in a broken world when we choose to be part of what God wants to rebuild, restore, and renew. And that's why this book tells us to expect some unpopularity, like Nehemiah did before he got started. And it's worth asking ourselves some questions, whether we're ready in ourselves for that kind of thing. Questions like this: am I a people pleaser or a God pleaser? Can I say no to people in order to say yes to God? What do I think I need from people that I was actually made to know from God? Am I hoping they're going to give me some of the love and acceptance and approval that God longs to give me, and wrestle maybe when it seems I'm unpopular with them? Is my self-esteem based on what other people think or say of me, or what God says about me? Do I have imposter syndrome? I don't know many people that think that God says they're an imposter. We usually like to think that somebody else around here is going to think I am that. When I make mistakes, and we all do, who do I think of first? What do I get embarrassed about? What might leave me avoiding someone? All key questions. Why do I get jealous of others? How would I like others to view me? And what am I prepared to do ensuring that it happens, even if that's not an entirely accurate view of me? All of these kind of questions tell whether we're ready to live for Jesus in a rebuilding way, even if that may be unpopular. Do I ever hesitate admitting that I'm a Jesus follower because I think someone might think I'm a bit like... We can take all of these things on by having a bigger view of God. The kind of view of God that Nehemiah had. Remembering that God, and not other people, God is awesome and glorious. Every day is not a popularity roller coaster in my life, but it's a path where I can climb knowing God's love and power. Because whatever happens, He loves you. Whatever happens, He loves you. The psalmist says, though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war rise against me, yet I will be content. Because he's choosing to focus on God's strength and God's ability. So it may be unpopular, firstly. Secondly, it's usually unhurried when we are rebuilding, restoring, and renewing. We see in verse 11, Nehemiah has arrived in Jerusalem with an important task. And let's face it, he's accountable to the most important people he knows. The king has sent him, and he's going to want to know, how are you getting on, Nehemiah? When are you coming back? He already knew that before he left. And it's also becoming urgent because he's very aware that en route, there's a bunch of people who've seen what he's doing and they don't like it already. One of those, as I've already suggested, is almost certainly Sanballat. He's got pals, and we discover he's busy recruiting a few other pals that are just by, force of en masse going to persuade them this is not a good idea, we're not happy about it. And those unhappy people were the movers and shakers, powerfully connected to the leaders such as they were in Jerusalem, the officials, the very same people that Nehemiah would need to speak to about rebuilding walls. So who's going to get to them first? Nehemiah better just make sure, right, Sanballat, and I know he's related to some of those bods. I better speak to them before he gets to them. As soon as I arrive at Jerusalem, isn't he? Isn't that what I would do? I'd be thinking, I've got to rush. He was there for 3 days, it tells us. What's that mean? 3 days is a lump of time. That seems quite intentional. That's more than just time to unpack, have a rest day, do the laundry, get ready for the next thing. What was he doing? Now, honestly, we don't know. We're not actually told what he's doing. But from the rest of the book of Nehemiah, I think it's a pretty safe bet to say he was praying. He was praying. Whoever else he needed to speak to about this, he'd seen some people who were unhappy about what he was going to do. And it was time to pray about that. He hadn't got to go and fix that. He's not going to sort out his own popularity, sort of get out there first, do his own little bit of self-promotion. Right, I better speak to God about this before I do anything else. He's unhurried. He wasn't panicking or rushing. What he was going to do was good work when he and all the rest were ready. We live in such a crazy, distracted world, people. Crazy, distracted world. And several studies have been done to highlight just how distracted we are. But I don't know if we're necessarily listening or want to change. I was fascinated by one I came across recently in particular, where they had asked some people to do nothing. Not for that long, actually. What you to do is sit in a room and just think for a few minutes. And they'd ask them, we'll sit you in a room for somewhere between 6 and 15 minutes and see how you get on with this. Do you know what? People hated it. Okay. So they reran the experiment and said, this time we'll sit you in a room for between 6 and 15 minutes. And you're at a table. We don't want you to do anything. You just think about whatever you want to think about. Oh, and by the way, there's a button on the table. If you press it, it will give you an electric shock. And they, before they'd gone in, they said, you don't want an electric shock, do you? No, I don't want an electric shock. What would you do I would pay money to avoid having an electric shock. Okay, well, anyway, that's the button there. Just go in the room and have a think. Well, in that time, in 6 to 15 minutes, 65% of men and 25% of women hit the button. What am I going to do here? What am I going to do? Why do we do that? Oh, I can't just sit here, can I? I can't just sit here. One bloke chose to press the button 190 times in 15 minutes. That's like more than once every 5 seconds. Barely got time to recover. It's easy to think we're not that bloke, but who are we when we're left with our thoughts? Nehemiah was unhurried in the things on his mind. He waits 3 days without being unkind to himself or to anybody else as he considers what he's going to do in this process of rebuilding. Do I have the confidence to wait 3 days in circumstances like that, where I feel I need to act, where I feel I need to speak, where I feel I've been misunderstood, where I feel people are going to get ahead of me and and may act against me. In his excellent book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, John Mark Comer quotes another writer saying, "Hurry is the great enemy of spiritual life in our day." I don't know if you've read the book. I highly recommend it. You should. If you haven't read the book, read it. If you've read the book, read it again, particularly if you don't think you've got time to. Are we hurrying too much? Are we trashing being in order to do or get? Well, there's things to rebuild, to restore, renew. Surely we've got to. That's right, isn't it? We hurry because we're annoyed too easily and by too much. We're dissatisfied with not enough. We hurry because we're anxious about many things. When we hurry, we miss wisdom. We ignore presence. When we hurry, we give up grace. When we hurry, we lose love. Why do we hurry? Why do we hurry so? However and wherever we will act to rebuild, restore, and renew, we need to make sure there's time to open the book, have a look at the bookmark, and remember, whatever happens, God loves you. Whatever happens, He loves you. So, it may be unpopular. It's good to be unhurried. And it's best begun unflinching. In verses 12 to 15, we read some details of the time that Nehemiah takes, making sure he had seen the worst of this wall. He'd heard some stuff, and that had that'd been gut-wrenching to him. Enough to pray, enough to make a crazy big ask of the king. And now he's there, he's come to see, to take an unflinching look at what needed rebuilding, restoring, renewing. I remember my DIY attempts over the years. One of my early ones was a bathroom in our first house. I decided I was going to tackle the bathroom. To be honest, I decided I was going to do as little as possible. I was going to try and untackle the bathroom in attempting the bathroom. There was a tile that had come loose, shower over the bath. There's a tile on the wall in the splash zone, a bit loose. Clearly, stuff needed doing. What I decided was, maybe I could just get one tile off and stick it back on again. And then it's all fine, isn't it? So I decide I'm going to refix this loose tile over the bath. And I take the first tile off, and then I realise, oh no, actually there's loads of tiles here that need taking off. So I've got to take another tile off, and another tile off, and another tile off. And then some of the wall is coming off with the tiles. I'm like, oh no. And then in the process, I drop a tile in the bath doing that, and I've now damaged the bath. Oh no. I can't leave the bath with that great big chunk out of it, can I? What am I going to do? And such was the age of the house. Lucky you if you've never seen such a thing. But the bath was some kind of green that emerged, escaped from the 70s. What was it? Avocado, pampas? So I don't want to be buying an avocado bath, do I now? I'm like, so I've got to get a white bath, avocado toilet. Okay. No. Oh no, if I replace the bath, I've got to replace the whole bathroom suite. I should have seen what it all needed in the first place. I should have taken an unflinching look at the bathroom. What's the scale of it? But Nehemiah was different. He was unhurried and unfazed by unpopularity. And so he was in the best place to take an unflinching look at the broken down walls before anything else. That's why it's so important that we reconcile our heart first. About not focused around what other people think, but about what God thinks. And we're ready to look at it in an unhurried way so that we've got time to see the scale of it and be able to give ourselves to it in the right way. We'll see in the coming weeks, this was never going to be about what Nehemiah could fix or sort out quickly on his own without God or without other people. God had changed Nehemiah's heart for him to even want to take that unflinching look. And others in his times needed to have a heart change too. We'll find out what did change and what didn't. But as we read it, we need to think about what might need to change in our own hearts as we step towards saying, God, I want to be the kind of person that will rebuild, restore, and renew. Taking an unflinching look at life with its broken walls is wanting to see them as God does and choosing to put ourselves in the place where we'll take that kind of look. And it's essential for working out what it takes. Jesus called it counting the cost. And he spoke about people starting out on a building project, needing to work out what it was going to take. I need to ask if I've got enough to make good on my decision to follow him and to be radical, to live faithfully for him, to make a difference in the world, to be salt and light like he said. Where do we need to look again at our life to see how God does? Are there things in my life or in yours where we should have seen what Jesus following really means and what it really needs? That's what an unflinching look at this faith of ours requires. And finally, it can be unapologetic. In Nehemiah 2, verse 20, we hear his response as these governors frankly gang up on him and say what they're going to say. Once the people of Jerusalem heard Nehemiah and how God was with him, they said, right, let's rise up and build. But Sanballat and Tobiah and now also Geshem just really laid into them verbally. They were despising them and dismissing them, belittling what they were about and what are you guys ever going to achieve? Even suggesting it was not only ridiculous, but rebellious. I mean, that's nonsense. Rebelling against the king couldn't be ridiculous and rebellious anyway. That doesn't add up because rebelling against the king is obviously really, really serious and was in those days fatally so. Maybe they're asking if they're mad, but the thing is, Nehemiah knew that he wasn't rebelling against the king, of course. The king had sent him. The king had ensured he got there safely. The king had sent him with letters for the resources that he needs in every way. So he wasn't rebelling against the king with his military escort and letters of authority. So I think we're meant to notice that their accusations were completely groundless. It's a lot of silly talk. It's nonsense. Doesn't always feel like that when important people are saying it at you. I don't know if you've noticed, but our news media seems to rush around expecting everyone to comment on stuff all the time these days. We can't wait with 24-hour news. We can't wait to know what people think about everything in this way. You know, there was a few days before Nehemiah went out and Nehemiah spoke to people and then Sanballat and Tobiah had turned up. But now, if they haven't said anything, they're sort of staying silent or something. And then all of a sudden it says, and so has broken their silence on this situation or that. It seems a curious kind of thing. I wonder if without any sense of God or moral absolutes, it seems like we have to keep track, checking on what we think or believe. So we're worried about who's going to break their silence and what's the truth about this anyway. I've got to rush around and ask myself. But as I look at that, I think, surely they just were trying to work out what they thought about it, or maybe it just took them a little time to carefully think about it first, but whatever. Such a crazy way we rush to hear what people are going to say and press them to say stuff before they've had a chance to think. Nehemiah clearly had given himself time. So he broke his silence, if you like, on the criticisms of Sanballat and Tobiah and Goshen by saying this in verse 20. The God of heaven will make us prosper, and we, his servants, will arise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. It's curious. It's curious by what he says, and in some ways by what he doesn't say. Nehemiah doesn't feel the need to defend himself or to point out, I think you're untrue. I can't be rebelling against the king. Do you remember the letter that I showed when I stayed with you, Sanballat? He could have said that, couldn't he? He could have justified himself and sort of buttoned it all up and 1-0 to me. Some kind of personal point scoring thing. He's not there to score points. He doesn't even feel the need to point out what was untrue or unfair. He just wants to speak about who God is and what he's been called to do in God. We find that in the Bible. Elsewhere in the Bible, in Proverbs, it says this, which I often think about when I'm trying to work out what to say. Proverbs 26, I think it's verses 4 and 5. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, or else he will be wise in his own eyes. Because I look at it and think, answer, not answer. Answer a fool, or else they're going to think they're right. Don't answer them, you don't get dragged in on it. Wouldn't it be nice if there's one right thing you did all the time? But Proverbs is trying to teach us that wisdom comes from a relationship with God, where in God we sense, as Jim prayed for the king's wisdom, the time to speak and the time to stay silent. Sometimes we should give an answer for the hope that we have, and other times, even though we may be ready to give an answer, it's wisest not to. Unhurried by faith is more likely to have the wisdom to know which to do at which time. I'm not going to say to you, this is what you should do at this time and that time, because the Bible's not trying to tell us a system of speaking and saying. It's trying to tell us to live out of relationship with him. That is ready. When we are secure in a relationship where whatever happens, I love you, we are ready to speak out of a relationship and to act out of a relationship, whatever we see or hear, however unexpected that may be. Whatever we say, it's more likely we will seek God's wisdom for how and when we answer if we live like that. Answering from a place of confidence and security is always remembering we are loved by God, whatever happens. Whatever happens. Nehemiah's life teaches us to expect some things when we take God's heart. That's what we're seeing in chapter 2 today. When we pray his kingdom come, and we realize we're going to be part of the answer to that and begin acting towards rebuilding, restoring, and renewing. But as I'm going to finish in just a few moments, I want to ask, where's the bookmark for you today? Where's the point at which, when you think about what you're going to do, you need to remember in that place that you are loved? Is it in popularity, when you recognize you're more tempted to act for popularity's sake than for God's glory? Is it in efficiency, when you just got to keep yourself busy because I've got to do something, better to do something wrong than nothing, just got to keep going? Is it in honesty and being realistic, recognizing what needs to be done, taking the time to look unflinchingly at life, see what is needed, how God might act, how he might lead you to speak to others on the basis of that? Maybe it's in the way that you interact with others, the wisdom that you might need for the people he's called you to rebuild his walls with, the way that your lives connect with them. Whatever way that is, I'd like us just to pray together now. Lord Jesus, you are awesome and glorious. So, so glorious. Together in prayer, we come before you to recognize who you are, to know again, see again in prayer your greatness, to speak it out and encourage each other in the truth of that. May we know your love and power again today, I pray. May we know the peace of your presence. May we know the faith to live unhurried lives as wall builders. Deliver us from passivity, Lord, but please deliver us from hurry. May we linger long enough with you to see our lives, other people, and our world just as you do, I pray. May our words be founded on your love. In that place, may we know the presence and the grace and the wisdom to speak as you would speak, to act as you would act, to love as you would act. Confidence of your grace, filled with your wisdom, all for your glory, Jesus. Amen.